and welcome to another episode of the Esther Krakue Show. Today I'm joined by author and journalist Peter Hitchens. Hi, Peter.
Hi.
Thank you for joining me. So today we're going to do a political parties quiz. So I'm just going to ask you some questions and you're going to elaborate on your views on them just to see what political party you fit in best with, okay?
You can try, yes.
I think we'll get there eventually. Okay, right. The first question is, are you currently experiencing COVID-19 symptoms?
No.
No, okay. Right. Should convicted criminals have the right to vote?
Well, that would depend on the crime involved. I'm not particularly interested in the subject, actually. I think in some circumstances you might possibly allow it, in others not, and it would depend first of all on the crime, secondly on the nature of their behaviour. But it really isn't an issue which concerns me very much.
Okay, so I'm just
I
going
don't vote myself, so I'm not particularly bothered by other people doing it.
Okay.
So should drug traffickers receive the death penalty?
No. And the death penalty, if you have it at all, this goes back to Montesquieu, has to be reserved really for murder. If you don't discriminate between life and everything else, then people will kill for all kinds of reasons. It would be disastrous. But it's the whole subject of the death penalty is not one you could really argue in an exchange like this anyway. It's too complicated.
Okay. Should non-violent prisoners be released from jail in order to reduce overcrowding?
Well, no, but this is one of those questions where you start at a point where I wouldn't begin. The problem with prisons is not about that. The problem with prisons is that criminals don't encounter prison until much too late in their criminal career for it to make any serious difference to them. Most people who end up in prison, except for homicides, probably will have committed something like 40 or 50 offences before they go there, by which time they're already hardened criminals anyway, so it's a waste of time.
Okay. Should the UK abolish university tuition fees?
I would like to go back to a system of much more rigorous selection and full maintenance grants and the payment of fees, which is what I was lucky enough to experience. But that would, of course, mean many fewer people going to university. People have to decide which they want. You can't have the number of people going to university we have now and have the system we used to have when I went to university.
Okay, so is that a yes? Because you had...
Well, that's what I would want. Yes, I would want to go back to no fees and full maintenance grants, but much smaller universities with many fewer people going to them.
Okay.
And would you support the return of a selective education system and the reintroduction of grammar schools?
Well, I constantly campaign for it, yes.
Should free meals be offered to all primary school students?
Well, when you say free, I mean people should be fed at school, and they shouldn't be charged for it. Obviously, there are a lot of people coming from homes where they're not necessarily being terribly well fed, and it's a useful social service. So, and if you started discriminating between people in an obvious way, then that might upset people. But none of these things are free. People pay taxes for education. They pay taxes for the meals that are given at school. I certainly don't think you should have a system which made people who were getting free school meals uncomfortable about it.
Okay. And on to domestic policy issues. Are you in favor of decriminalizing drug use?
No.
How come?
Well, why should I be? And why should I be in favor of people wrecking their lives by taking drugs which threaten and destroy their mental health and ruin the hopes and happiness of their families? Who with any sense would be in favor of that?
Okay. Do you support the use of 0-hour contracts?
Well, I can see some people might want to operate them. It suits some people, but I certainly don't think they should be forced on people. It's difficult in an economy that decayed as badly as ours to try and demand a system of steady, secure jobs of the kind that existed when I went to work, though I have to say I much prefer it to what we have at the moment. I think some people do benefit from 0-hours contracts, but they're not themselves an absolute evil. But I think that I would rather there were less of them.
Okay, so that's a no. So should the UK reinstate a form of mandatory national service?
No.
Should the minimum voting age be lowered?
No, it should be raised. I should think probably. I certainly wasn't fit to vote until I was about 30. I think it's pretty good age to start.
That's quite a jump from 18 to 30.
Well, it is, yes, but I mean, I also favour extra votes for people who have more experience with life. People, no, I do. It's a serious proposition. If people who successfully raised a family, who'd served in the military, who'd performed acts of great bravery and generosity, got extra votes, then you'd have more votes for wise people, and they would have more influence over the outcome of elections, which would be a good thing. And more wisdom would be a very good thing in a society like ours, which is very short of it at the moment.
Okay.
That's quite a fair assessment, I suppose. Should foreigners currently residing in the United Kingdom have the right to vote?
Well, I don't have any particular developed view on this. I think some of them have for a long time had the right to vote in local elections. Citizens of the Irish Republic have, since the Irish independence, had an absolute right to vote in domestic elections. I think, in general, for voting in national elections, you really should have the citizenship of the country involved. I wouldn't expect to go and live in the United States, even as a permanent resident, and get to vote in a presidential or even a local election. So, in general, no. I think if you want to take out citizenship, then you get a vote. That seems to be a reasonable bargain. But it's more complicated here, particularly because of the Irish arrangement. And it was complicated because of the special rights given to citizens of the European Union, which will shortly come to an end.
Okay. Should the UK switch to a proportional representation voting system?
Absolutely not, no.
Okay, how come?
Well, because it means that all governments are coalitions. At the moment, you have political parties which are coalitions, but they present themselves as they are to the electors. And so if you vote for them, you know which coalition you're getting. In a proportional representation system, quite often the political parties then spend 6 weeks or even months, and I think in Belgium once more than a year, cooking up a coalition which has absolutely no bearing on what people voted for. And it simply leads to post-election stitch-ups over which you have no control. The other thing is that a first-past-the-post system gives you that fantastic power of turning out a bad government overnight. So there is the Prime Minister with his piano and his other possessions sitting in Downing Street, who the previous day was a man of great power and today is nothing. And it's a peaceful revolution. It's a very good system to provide a safety valve against discontent and also to keep politicians on their toes. I don't think proportional representation allows that. You can't simply get rid of people when you don't want them to be there anymore. And I think people would really miss that when it was gone.
Okay. Do you agree with the UK's Brexit decision to withdraw from the European Union?
I would not have gone this way. I think that it was a stupid way of doing it, and I think it will probably end in a very bad mess. I don't think people really knew what it was they were voting for or against. I think that we created a huge constitutional crisis by creating two rival forms of popular authority, the referendum vote versus parliament. It's still not resolved. We're still not out of it. We still don't know what's going to happen. I would have wanted a much perhaps slower process of there being a political party which wanted to leave the EU and which won an election on that programme and clearly stated why it wanted to do so and what it would do with the new freedoms it has. At the moment, I think a lot of people are clear why it is we are leaving. There are two completely separate arguments for doing so.
Should the UK abolish the Human Rights Act?
I think we could manage perfectly without it, but to do so, we would have to revive our memories of our own, in my view, much better legislation, particularly the 1689 Bill of Rights, which is a far better guarantee of freedom. The problem with the 1689 Bill of Rights is it's largely forgotten, and the courts and the government have taken to ignoring it. I think we should revive it. It would be a better protection. Vague charters saying we're in favour of this lovely thing and that lovely thing are all very well. But the problem is they conflict with each other, the clauses in these charters. And they simply put more power in the hands of judges. The terrific thing about the 1689 Bill of Rights is it says the government cannot do this flatly. And the real purpose of building liberty into your constitution is to prevent the government from doing things, such as the things it's doing now, by keeping people under house arrest. It shouldn't be able to do that. It shouldn't be able to fine people in the street for that. In fact, technically it isn't, but because, as I say, the Bill of Rights has largely died, people aren't aware of this. I say revive the Bill of Rights. It's still on the statute books. It's still technically alive. All it needs to do is for people to remember what it says and to abide by it.
Okay.
Should the UK renew its Trident nuclear weapons program?
No. We should retain a few nuclear warheads, probably on cruise missiles or perhaps for delivery by aircraft, because we've got them and it'd be silly to completely throw them away. But Trident is a Cold War weapon and it's a superpower weapon. And the Cold War ended in 1989, and we haven't been a superpower probably since about 1915. So it seems to me to be ludicrous. It's like taking out insurance against alien abduction while neglecting to insure yourself against fire and theft. It's an absurd system, and it should be. It should.
That's quite an analogy.
I think so.
Okay. Should the government increase environmental regulations on businesses to reduce carbon emissions?
Well, I'm not sure about carbon emissions, but certainly for a very long time, I think government has been very weak about keeping the air clean. I think the main policy any government ought to have, and this has been shown by the past few weeks to anybody who hasn't realized it, should be in reducing the amount of private car use, which is ludicrous. But to end that, it's not just a matter of telling companies to behave. It's a matter of stopping building society around the motor car. All our cities are designed around the motor car. Our working lives are designed around the motor car. You don't have to do this. You take major continental cities such as Zurich, which have now wholly displaced the motor car by introducing effective, good public transport, particularly trams, which I'm a huge enthusiast for. And I think we should do much, much more to rebuild that sort of public transport, electrically powered, trams in cities, railways between them, and reduce the use of private cars to a much more sensible level than the one we have. And then the air would be enormously cleaner, and also the world would be quieter.
Yep. Okay, should disposable products such as plastic cups, plates, and cutlery that contain less than 50% of biodegradable material be banned?
I don't know whether it's practical to ban them. Certainly, I think that the development of a throwaway society has been a mistake. But are we prepared to reintroduce the washing up of crockery and all the other things that would, and the old thing which I used to do as a child of taking your bottles back to the shop,
Oh, yeah.
which I thought was wonderful. I used to make quite a lot of extra pocket money out of doing that. Are we prepared to do that? Would we actually be willing to do the extra work involved in getting rid of plastic, which is a tremendously labor saving thing, and that's why people use it.
Okay.
Again, it's down to individuals. Are people really prepared to live the slightly more difficult lives that a society with less plastic in it would demand?
Okay.
I am, but are
I
you?
don't know if everyone else is. Yeah, it's not necessarily a popular opinion, especially
No. It's easy to say and harder to do, like so many of these things. It's one of those things where you can be publicly pious and sound terribly wonderful, but are you prepared to do it yourself?
Yeah.
Do you support the use of hydraulic fracking to extract oil and natural gas resources?
No, I'm against it. I'm very worried about what happens to the water afterwards, particularly. I think there's just a straightforward loss there, and I just don't think it's justified. And I think the seismic danger does seem to me to be real as well in some places. So I certainly, it might be okay in huge countries with large expanses of desert, but I'm certainly not in favour of it in a much more cramped and much smaller island.
Okay. Should foreign visitors have to pay for emergency medical treatment during their stay in the UK?
Emergency medical treatment, I don't think anybody should have to pay for. It's basically mercy, and mercy should never be charged for. But it's when it comes to non-emergency medical treatment, you have a different matter. Obviously, people should be encouraged where possible to take out insurance. I doubt you'd go particularly to the United States without insuring yourself medically. It would just be stupid. But people can underinsure or they can forget, and you're not going to leave them lying on the pavement bleeding because they can't pay. That would be barbaric. But on the other hand, I think that if it's any other kind of medical treatment, then if you haven't contributed, then I think people can reasonably be charged. Difficult to arrange, but once you have a reputation for making it plain, people are less likely to come as health tourists, which has been a problem. People do pay a heck of a lot for the National Health Service, and I think it's annoying for them to find out that a lot of what they've paid has gone to treating people who haven't made any contribution ever.
Ever, yeah. Do you think there should be more or less privatization of the NHS? That's quite a complicated question, that one.
My approach to the NHS is nothing to do with ownership. I think the NHS is wrongly configured. What we should really be trying to do is have a real national health service which concerns itself with prevention of illness rather than waiting for people to get ill and then trying to put them right. And there's far too little emphasis on prevention in our system. If I were reforming it, it would be prevention that I would concentrate on. I'd give people very considerable tax breaks if they took more care of themselves, for instance. I wouldn't charge people extra if they hadn't, but I think that if people did keep themselves healthier and avoid becoming ill in ways which are not actually that difficult to do, we should give people tax breaks for that. And I think that the whole approach should be prevention, 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 not waiting for people to become ill and then trying to fix it with expensive operations and expensive drugs.
Okay.
Should there be more or less privatization of hospital and healthcare services? I think you've sort of just answered this.
I don't really care. I mean, I very much, it would be what would work for me. I don't think it's necessary. As long as people aren't charged for mercy, as long as people can expect to be treated, and particularly children, and the old. But as long as people can be guaranteed to be able to go to a doctor and get treated for an illness or an emergency when they need it, I'm really not particularly concerned who owns the joint where it happens. And I think there is quite a lot of use, for instance, of private hospitals by the NHS now, which is, I think, pretty satisfactory for everybody involved. So I'm not against that. There doesn't seem to be a principle involved. I'm in favour of state ownership where it makes sense, and in favour of private ownership where that makes sense. So, for instance, I'd nationalise the railways again tomorrow. I'd do the same with electric power generation. But there are some other things where I'm much less troubled.
Okay. Right. Do you support the use of nuclear energy?
Yes.
Okay. Should the government require children to be vaccinated for preventable diseases?
Well, I think there has to be a conscience clause. Some people are very disturbed by vaccines, and it is undoubtedly the case that there are a small number of cases, I know of some, where vaccines go wrong. And I think that it's beyond the power of government to force somebody to have basically an invasive medical treatment, which is what a vaccination is. I think if you want people to get vaccinated, you should be very careful to explain to them and kindly bring them along. If they have doubts, you should listen to them. I think bullying people into having vaccinations is actually counterproductive.
Okay. Should there be a temporary ban on all immigration into the UK?
I doubt whether such a thing would be practicable. It's never crossed my mind to think of it. All countries will have a certain amount of immigration at any time, unless they're North Korea, where nobody wants to go there anyway. But I think total bans, they're the stuff of fantasy. They're not something anyone can practically do. And why would you anyway? You have to allow some people, and we need people who have skills we don't.
Okay.
People need to bring in members of their families as well. It's just
that's a form of immigration. Yeah. Okay, so should Muslim immigrants be banned from entering the country until the government improves its ability to screen out potential terrorists?
No.
No, that's
I mean, how would a government ever be able to screen out a potential terrorist anyway? What would
anyway, yeah.
You'd need to have some kind of thought-reading, secret police, Doctor Who machine to do it. It's just not practical.
Okay. Should the UK increase or decrease the amount of temporary work visas given to high-skilled immigrant workers?
I don't know. I've never thought about it.
Indifferent.
Well, I just don't know. It's not something I claim to have any knowledge of. So I have very strong opinions on things which I care about and which I think I know about. But where I don't, these technicalities are not. I'm sure it's terribly important, but it just has never really been something that I've spent much time worrying about.
Okay. Should the government increase spending on public transportation?
Hugely, yeah.
Okay. And should the National Railway be privatized? Actually, you said the opposite earlier. You said it should be nationalized.
No, it should be renationalised.
Yeah.
And the railway lines ripped up after the Beeching Marples vandalism of the 1960s should be replaced and put back where they were before.
Okay.
Should the London Underground be considered an essential service which would ban all future worker strikes?
I don't believe in banning strikes. I think that there has to be the freedom to withdraw labour. So no, I've been a trade union member all my life. I think the strike weapon should be very, very rarely used, but if you take it away, it's despotic. And I think in things like the fire service, I think you should probably expect, if you go and work for the fire service, that you will never go on strike. And obviously, the police can't go on strike for similar reasons. And I was very disturbed by the recent doctors' strikes, and I wouldn't want anyone in the health service to strike either. But I think banning strikes is going too far. I think that the freedom to do so needs to exist for this to be a free society.
Okay.
Should the UK assassinate suspected terrorists in foreign countries?
No.
Yeah, that's quite an uncomfortable question as well. Do you support the death penalty? I believe you said no.
Well, I think I couldn't support it under current circumstances because it needs so many conditions which our current courts don't simply don't meet. I don't think the current jury system is up to standard. For instance, both the composition of the juries, the ability to make a majority verdict, the way in which trials are conducted now, the extraordinary weakness of many judges in the face of what seem to me to be very bad prosecutions, mean that in particular, I'd find it very hard to support its return here. But there is a case for it under better circumstances, particularly because of not because of its deterrence of murder, but because of its deterrence of the carrying and use of lethal weapons by criminals, in which I think it is highly effective.
Okay. Should gay couples have the same adoption rights as straight couples?
I wouldn't take away a freedom that had already been given. It's a dead argument to me.
So that's no. Oh, that's yes.
No, I said I wouldn't take away a freedom that had already been given. It's a dead argument, which I'm sick to the teeth of. I don't want it.
Okay. Do you support the legalization of same-sex marriage? I think that's kind of along the same lines.
It's already
Well,
legal.
again, it's a minor issue to me, which I think is a distraction. What I actually am much more concerned about is the almost total collapse of heterosexual marriage.
Okay. Why is that a concern for you?
Well, I think, in a free society, you have to have strong families, and strong families have to be based on, in my view, lifelong marriage. And if, as has been the case in this country since the late 1960s, marriage is so easy to bring to an end that lifelong marriage is increasingly a rarity, and a lot of people don't get married in the first place, then you don't have strong families in which people can learn the basic lessons of life, or indeed independence of mind and all kinds of other things which the state can't provide. And if you have weak families, you have a strong state. And I'm very worried by the development of strong state.
Okay. Should the UK raise taxes on the rich?
No, probably not, because they wouldn't pay them. For rich people, tax is voluntary. They can almost invariably afford to pay the lawyers and the accountants to get out of doing so. So it's probably ineffective. I think that if you want to have tax reform, then actually you have to look seriously at why taxes are so high on the poor, which they are. And many of the taxes which are levied on the poor are indirect taxes, which are regressive and fall very heavily on them. This country has a very, very large budget every year, much of which needs to be seriously looked at. And again, I think if we had strong families instead of an enormous welfare state, we might be better off. I think that would be a better place to start than trying to argue about who should pay how much. So say if you increase taxes for the rich, they just stop paying them.
Should the government raise the national minimum wage?
I don't think so. I think the problem with national minimum wages is eventually they reach the point where they either encourage illegal employment or they discourage employers from employing people in the first place. And I think there is always that danger. Minimum wages work as long as they're kept low. As soon as they get generous, then they start working, and that's the great paradox of them. They're a lovely idea, but in practice they don't work very well.
Okay, and the last question, which I think you've kind of already answered, but in a different way, should the top tax rate of income over £150,000 be raised to 50%?
Well, I wouldn't hugely object to it. I don't think that it's something that I could get particularly outraged about. but I'm not sure that it would raise all that much money. Again, I'm more worried about the government spending too much of our money, and in fact, spending too much of poor people's money, than I am about trying to take more money from people. I think that the society is actually healthier if people keep more of the rewards of their work, and that's all the way from the very bottom to the very top. I think there are some grotesque overpayments at the very top of the moment, but as I say, you'll find that people who are getting those grotesque overpayments are almost certainly armored against any attempt to tax them more heavily. They won't actually pay if you try.
Okay.
And I'm going to ask you what qualities are most important to you in a candidate. I'm just going to list off a bunch of qualities, and then whichever resonates with you, then I'll just tick it off. All right?
Yeah.
Okay, right. Integrity, intelligence, transparency, consistency, effectiveness, honesty, common sense, commitment, accountability, leadership, vision, morality, determination, and communication.
Did you mention wisdom or experience though?
I did not.
Well, they're the ones I go for.
Okay, I'll add it. Wisdom and experience.
Wisdom and experience.
Okay.
And intelligent people can often be total disasters, I have to say, if their intelligence is not guided by wisdom.
Okay.
They can be you know the concept of the stupid intelligent person. It's terribly clever, but you don't know what to do. Wisdom and experience are what do it for me. That's one of the reasons why I don't vote, because there's so little of it about.
Okay. Right, let's let the algorithm spit out your results. Oh wow, you're 76% conservative.
Well, I seem to be 56% Labour, 57% Green.
Green, yeah. 63% UKIP. And 39% Brexit Party.
Yeah, well, that's obviously that's obviously tripe, isn't it?
I think this is a very classical liberal.
I'm not a liberal.
Well, I don't even know how. It's quite a mashup because your Conservative is the highest, but your Labour is pretty high as well.
Yeah, you see, and I amazingly I score 50% on the Greens.
Yeah,
On the Greens.
that's very weird. All right, but
It ought to be weird.
sorry. Thank you so much for coming, Peter. It's been a pleasure having you.
It's been a joy talking to you.
Thank you very much.